taken out of context.
Taken out of context.
Taking things out of context.
Out of context.
Taken out of context.
Taken out of context.
In the context.
We have more context.
Out of context.
Taken out of context.
That is so out of context.
And take shit out of context.
Out of context.
Deeply out of context.
You're taking it out of context.
No, hey, hold on. So we're going to flesh this out because I don't want nobody saying we don't take things in context.
Clipped me out of context.
It was out of context.
It's hard for your words to be taken out of context.
The full context.
In a modern day context.
Tell me the context.
Another important reminder as to why context is so important. So,
under the Copyright Act of 1976, I am within my full legal right to share these following clips via photographs, video, audio, and screenshot from the public domain. The following creators allow reshare, download, and redistribution of their content, and as always, I credit them in the description box down below. Fair use, public domain, TikTok, and TikTok Live third-party license allows fair use for the purposes of reaction, commentary, news reporting, entertainment, parody, teaching, research, criticism, scholarship, and comedy. I am within my basic human right, my civil constitutional rights to share under the First Amendment to the Constitution, my thoughts, feelings, critiques, and criticisms, opinions, and expressions. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees my freedom of religion, free speech, free assembly, freedom of the press, and the right to petition the government and air my grievances. The First Amendment does not cover lies that amount to defamation, slander, libel, harassment, threats, targeting, bullying, cybercrimes, doxing, and any other verbal crimes. I worked incredibly hard for days on this video. If you've followed me for a long time, you know that I've done a video and an update to that video called the Gypsy Rose Blanchard Agenda. Well, I have an updated version and we are going to dive right in. On June 10th of 2015, between 2:20 and 2:30 a.m., Dee Dee Blanchard was murdered. She was murdered while she was sleeping in her own bed in her own home. She suffered 17 stab wounds and was nearly decapitated. 5 days later, on June 15th of 2015, her daughter, Gypsy Rose Elcida Blanchard, and her internet boyfriend, Nicholas Paul Godejohn, were apprehended at his mother and stepfather's house in Wisconsin. Monday, July 11th, 2016, Gypsy Rose Blanchard accepts and enters a plea deal, admitting and accepting her guilt. But the plea deal was for a lesser offense than what she committed, second degree, and she got a 10-year sentence with that plea deal, having to serve 85% before eligible for parole. On March 11th, 2017, Mommy Dead and Dearest premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival. This would be the first of many documentaries that Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her family would participate in, consenting, agreeing, and signing contracts for. This documentary was produced by HBO, and there was actually two different premieres, one in New York and the one that Christy, Rod, and Mia Blanchard attend at the South by Southwest Film Festival. The documentary, Mommy, Dead, and Dearest, was produced by HBO. The director is a female named Erin Lee Carr, and this came out on May 16th of 2017. On November 21st of 2017, Gypsy Rose Blanchard sat down to do a prison interview with Dr. Phil. On November 22nd, 2017, the very next day, part 2 of her interview with Dr. Phil aired. On January 4th, 2018, Rod and Christy Blanchard not only do an article, but there was a sit-down, which the article was based off of, with ABC News' Amy Robach, speaking about Gypsy, her case, and her alleged abuse, citing it as a reason why Gypsy would want her mother dead. The very next day, January 5th, 2018, Nicholas Godejohn does one of the only prison interviews that he's ever participated in. And this was done by Sophie Cunningham and her affiliate. This interview has made the rounds on social media and YouTube for years. This is where Nick admits that Gypsy is the one who planned on killing her mom and that she had tried to kill her mom twice all by herself, a year and a half before ever meeting him in October of 2012. He also admits in this interview that it was Gypsy who told him she got the idea from a previous boyfriend or, quote, man, unquote. That doesn't make it true. It just means that Gypsy, instead of owning accountability for planning the murder of her mom, she was making Nick believe that she got the idea from somebody else. On February 27th of 2018, Rod and Christy Blanchard are in an article in the Springfield News Leader. This is where they talk extensively about cooperating for a scripted TV series called By Proxy. And if you don't know, this is Fancy Maselli from the Good Wives Network. This was to be her series. November 6th of 2018. A documentary entitled Gypsy's Revenge by Investigation Discovery aired. Not even a week later, on November 13th of 2018, Nicholas Godejohn's trial begins. And now we come to the one and only dramatized series, entitled The Act, where Patricia Arquette and Joey King play the mother-daughter duo. This was produced by Hulu, the streaming giant, and this premiered on March 20th of 2019. In June of 2025, Gypsy Rose lies to Tori Spelling on the Tori Spelling podcast Misspelling, stating that Hulu stole her story, that they made a success out of it. She did not get paid. She did not get paid life rights, and nobody from the production, the cast, had ever reached out to her. In January of 2026, Gypsy does the podcast Nobody Should Believe Me with Andrea Dunlop, where she is forced to admit that that is a lie and defamation. A YouTuber named 1980s Millennial Commentates has Gypsy Rose Blanchard's prison emails, where she finds one that is from the producer of The Act. Not only did Gypsy Rose Blanchard get paid $50,000, they broke it up into two different payments, $30,000 and $20,000. She also had contact not just with this producer, but also with Joey King herself. When preparing for her role as Gypsy Rose Blanchard, Joey King had private conversations with Gypsy Rose, and she admits this when being asked this specific question on the red carpet. However, it's very unlikely that Hulu or producers are going to sue Gypsy Rose Blanchard for defamation regarding what she said on Tori Spelling's podcast. Nonetheless, this is The Act. This is a huge reason why people around the world even know of the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, because of this dramatized series. The second interview that Nicholas Godejohn ever does is a sit-down with the Oxygen Network, and this aired July 11th, 2019. He speaks extensively about why he does the sit-down, and also his biological father does a sit down. Nearly 2 weeks later, on July 22nd of 2019, the Oxygen Network does their episode about the crime, and it is entitled Killer Couples, regarding Gypsy and Nick. On January 21st of 2021, the Killer Cases series does an episode entitled Killin' Mama. Now, if you thought that was a lot, we're just getting started. On April 29th of 2022, True Crime Central does a documentary about the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, and it's called Would You Kill My Mother for Me? Fancy Maselli, who was working with the Blanchards and was a family friend and spokesperson, partakes in this. On May 2nd of 2022, HBO does an episode on their podcast, HBO Docs Podcast, or HBO Docs Club. Season 1, Episode 4 is about Mommy, Dead, and Dearest. Now, it's really important to note that Lifetime, which is owned by the A&E Network, is already working on the prison confessions of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Filming has already began for the 6-part docu-series. It's also really important to note that in July of 2022, Gypsy Rose Blanchard marries Ryan Anderson, which their marriage officially happens July 21st of 2022. Now, some time does elapse, but they are filming the prison confessions of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She is working with Melissa G. Moore and her literary agent on her upcoming ebook, and Gypsy Rose Blanchard is granted parole after serving 8.5 years. On December 22nd of 2023, Law and Crime does a documentary called The Twisted Case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and Fancy Maselli is also in this documentary. Of course, she had long broken ties with Gypsy Rose and the Blanchard family. The very next day, on December 28th of 2023, Gypsy Rose Alcida Blanchard is released from prison after serving 8.5 years, where she will have to serve another 1.5 years on parole, equaling her 10-year plea deal. Now, this day is really important because this is a week after her release. On January 5th of 2024, Lifetime, which is owned by the A&E Network, releases a 6-part docuseries called The Prison Confessions of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. On the same day, January 5th of 2024, Christy Blanchard sits down and does an interview with News Nation. Gypsy Rose and her husband, Ryan Anderson, are also in New York City. Because of the release date, Lifetime and the A&E Network in New York City have the Prison Confessions premiere, where Gypsy Rose and ex-husband Ryan Anderson are on the red carpet. Also, on January 5th of 2024, Gypsy Rose does a sit-down interview with Good Morning America. Now, during this interview, Good Morning America got a lot of footage because they run another interview from this exact day, subsequently 2 more times. And you're also going to notice that on January 5th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a lot of press, but she changes clothes. And just because something is recorded on one day doesn't mean it's the day that it airs. On January 5th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard and then husband Ryan Anderson do a sit-down interview with ABC News. Also, on January 5th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down interview with Access Hollywood. Also, same day, January 5th, 2024, Gypsy does a sit-down interview with The View. However, she did change her clothes. Gypsy Rose also, on January 5th of 2024, does a sit-down interview with E! News. But the same day, she also does an interview with a podcast called The Vile Files with Nick Vile, but this airs on January 8th of 2024. The very next day, January 9th of 2024, Ben Bella Books releases Gypsy's ebook called Released: Conversations on the Eve of Freedom. On January 15th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard makes the cover of People magazine. January 26th of 2024, ABC 2020 runs an episode called The Next Act. This is about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, but they also update this episode and run it on ABC's 2020 not once, but 2 more times. The second and third times being the early spring and the early fall of 2024. In October of 2023, before being released, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was emailing with TMZ employees directly, where she tells TMZ to not say that they talked to her directly because she's under an NDA and contract with Lifetime and the A&E Network. This legal liability is one reason why mainstream media doesn't want to work with Gypsy Rose anymore, other than just the backlash that they receive from the public. However, Gypsy Rose Blanchard travels to Los Angeles, where she calls TMZ and arranges to sell stories, videos, and photographs to them. On May 4th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her stepmother, Christy Blanchard, talked to, are recorded and photographed at the airport by TMZ, which of course they run stories on. But during this trip, Gypsy Rose Blanchard also does the TMZ tour with Christy Blanchard. But her relationship with TMZ is far from over, even though today, in 2026, they've really distanced themselves from covering Gypsy Rose. Now, 2 days before the TMZ airport incident, the reason why Gypsy Rose is going to Los Angeles is because she's doing a red carpet event promoting her upcoming reality series with the same network, Lifetime, owned by the A&E Network, called Gypsy Rose Blanchard, Life After Lockup. This would be in regards to season 1. However, during that same event, Gypsy Rose Blanchard is interviewed by Entertainment Tonight. On May 3rd, Gypsy Rose Blanchard also does an interview and is on The View once again. However, because she was not in studio, she does it via video. On May 30th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down interview with ABC News. This is where she's cited saying that she feels like everybody wants a perfect victim. Also on May 30th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down interview with People magazine. She also does little skits with her stepmother for their socials. These were likely all filmed in the beginning of May when Gypsy Rose and her stepmother Christy Blanchard were in Los Angeles. However, this airs later. Same day, May 30th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a video interview sit down with Access Hollywood. On May 30th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a video sit down interview with Extra. But this isn't the only one, because on May 30th, 2024, they also run another interview exclusive with Gypsy Rose. The very next day, on May 31st of 2024, Gypsy Rose gives an interview to Entertainment Tonight, again via video. On June 1st of 2024, Gypsy Rose does a video interview with Extra TV. But you're going to notice she's wearing the same thing she did multiple other video interviews. It was likely filmed the same day. They just aired it later. On June 3rd of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard's reality show with Lifetime and the A&E network called Gypsy Rose: Life After Lockup, Season 1 premieres. 2 days later, on June 5th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Ryan Anderson do a sit-down interview with Chris Jericho on his platform, which is largely YouTube. However, Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Ryan Anderson have already split months prior, and she's already back with an ex-prison fiance named Ken Urker, and is already pregnant. Same day, June 5th of 2024, Ryan Anderson does a sit-down interview with Extra. It's a very somber interview because he was by himself and he was speaking about Gypsy Rose Blanchard leaving him and filing for divorce. In July of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does an appearance on the Hulu show The Kardashians, Season 5, Episode 8. Gypsy Rose talks to Kim Kardashian about prison reform and being an advocate. On July 6th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down video interview with Us. But you will notice that this was likely taken earlier. On July 12th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down interview with E! News, where she promises to never put her baby in front of a camera, except for private home movies, stating that the world is dangerous and unsafe, and she does not want her baby in the media. On October 10th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard did a speaking engagement for San Francisco State University, talking about prison reform. In this speaking engagement, she mentions the Menendez brothers. The very next day, on October 11th of 2024, because Gypsy Rose and Ken Urker are in Los Angeles, Gypsy Rose does a sit-down interview in studio with Fox 11 Los Angeles, where she says that taking medication the week of her crime had no effect on her mental state, which was a claim that she had previously made in Mommy Dead and Dearest. 3 days later, on October 14th of 2024, TMZ are called to the airport and speak to Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her baby daddy Ken Urker, where they ask her questions about the Menendez brothers, and she refuses to answer anything, stating that she doesn't know much about their case. However, while she was doing her speaking engagement, she brings them up. 2 days later, on October 16th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard reaches out to the Vile Files, Nick Vile, to do his podcast once again, but this time she doesn't have her husband, Ryan Anderson, she has her baby daddy, Ken Urker. This was filmed in Los Angeles before flying back home to Louisiana. A month later, on November 16th of 2024, Gypsy Rose and Ken have their baby shower for their baby girl. Gypsy's younger half-sister, Mia Blanchard, is the organizer of the baby shower, and it was filmed for her show. On December 9th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a video interview with Live Signing. And when you go and look at the chat replay, there was only 2 comments. The reason was because Gypsy Rose was promoting her book. On December 10th of 2024, Ben Bella Books releases this book written by Melissa G. Moore and her literary agent. It is a memoir about Gypsy Rose Blanchard's life called My Time to Stand. On December 10th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, very pregnant, does a sit-down interview with WWL-TV. This is to promote her memoir, My Time to Stand. On December 11th through December 16th, 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a podcast called Barely Famous Podcast, and the host is Kale Lowry, who was a teen mom. Kale Lowry released this for sale on her Patreon. However, she was having technical difficulties. Those were resolved in full by December 16th of 2024, of which her entire interview was finally uploaded in full. On December 12th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a video interview with Extra, talking about her life, talking about her pregnancy, and promoting her memoir. On December 13th of 2024, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a book signing event, a meet and greet, at the Garden District Bookshop in New Orleans, Louisiana. This event stirred a lot of backlash for Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and a vigil for her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, took place outside the event. On December 28th of 2024, the 1-year anniversary of her release from prison, Gypsy Rose Alcida Blanchard and Ken Erker welcome their daughter, whom they named Aurora Raina Erker. On February 27th of 2025, Gypsy and Ken do People magazine, talking about their birth story, Gypsy's birth experience, her upcoming parole end date, and their future plans. What a lot of people don't know is the CEO of the A&E network cut ties and did not want to renew Gypsy Rose for a season 3 of her reality show, Gypsy Rose Life After Lockup. In March of 2025, Gypsy Rose and Ken Erker go to Los Angeles once again, where TMZ is called to the airport to speak to Gypsy again. On March 5th of 2025, Gypsy Rose and Ken Erker do a sit-down interview with Access Hollywood, where they speak about being new parents and future plans. Also, on March 5th of 2025, Gypsy does a sit-down video interview with Loose Women, which exclusively aired on their YouTube channel. On March 9th of 2025, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down video interview with Friedland TV. This interview is one that not a lot of people have seen or know about. The very next day, on March 10th of 2025, Lifetime Network, which is owned by the A&E network, releases season 2 Gypsy Rose Life After Lockup. Because she broke her contract and her NDA with Lifetime and the A&E network, they cut all ties and ended the possibility of a season 3 because Gypsy Rose proved herself a legal liability. It'll be very rare if mainstream media ever chooses to work with Gypsy Rose Blanchard again, not only because of this fact, but the backlash. On March 24th of 2025, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does a sit-down interview with 60 Minutes Australia. However, this was filmed when she was still pregnant prior to December of 2024. It just aired later. On June 25th of 2025, Gypsy does a video interview sit down for the podcast by Tori Spelling called Miss Spelling. However, only part 1 aired on this date. On June 30th of 2025, part 2 of her interview with Tori Spelling airs. It's also important to note that when part 1 airs, Gypsy was getting off of parole, which she did successfully do. July 12th of 2025, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does an interview with ABC News. She speaks to them via phone, but they use old footage from previous interviews with her to run this interview. On October 15th of 2025, Her ex-husband, Ryan Anderson, does a sit-down with Sarah Fraser for The Sarah Fraser Show, which you can find on all of her social platforms. On December 28th of 2025, Gypsy Rose, Elcida Blanchard, and Ken Erker celebrate their daughter's first birthday and Gypsy's 2-year anniversary from being released from prison. January 15th of 2026, Ryan Anderson sits down with Sarah Fraser a second time because she has a lot of questions regarding the Freedom of Information Act request and all of the videos pertaining to the very sexually explicit videos that Gypsy Rose was sending to Nicholas Godejohn and vice versa. On January 30th, 2026, Gypsy Rose Blanchard does the podcast called Nobody Should Believe Me with Andrea Dunlop. Like most podcast interviews, this is only part 1. The podcast Nobody Should Believe Me with Andrea Dunlop, part 2, is not yet released, nor does it have a release date. As of January of 2026, Gypsy Rose Blanchard announced that she herself will have a podcast. She also claims on her Linktree that she is an advocate, an author, and Gypsy Rose has also created a website. Her public defender turned manager has no longer a business relationship with Gypsy Rose Blanchard since she got off parole. Gypsy Rose now claims that she handles all of her own business inquiries. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, via her Instagram page, has dropped a very few short clips regarding her podcast, yet it's still to be determined whether or not this podcast is going to ever take place. And this does not cover any of the social media nor the mainstream media website articles that have been ran during this time. And this is what I call the Gypsy Rose Blanchard agenda.
5. Keep making content.
Let me know what you think down in the comment section. I hope you all have a fantastic week and weekend. And if you liked my video, don't forget to subscribe, like, turn on notifications, and share.